Manchester City deployed a range of systems and tactics in their historic 23-24 Premier League title win. From modifying the treble-winning John Stones system to starting strikers in a double pivot and to the inevitable rise of Phil Foden, this video will delve into Guardiola's strategic innovations, analysing what succeeded and what faltered, as City once again etched their name into football history. The 23-24 league season for City can be divided into 3 phases. We'll begin with phase 1, spanning from match week 1 to match week 19, the halfway point of the season. This season's City team differed significantly from the treble-winning side, not only in personnel, but also in structure and principles. Mahrez and Laporte had been replaced with Doku and Guardiola, 2 brilliant but young players, and Gundogan was replaced with, well, no one. Failed pursuits of Paquetá, Bellingham and Rice left City with Kovacic and Núñez to fill the Gundogan void. Quality players in their own right, but by no means a direct replacement. And this, coupled with injuries, forced Pep to adapt. This is what we know to be City's treble-winning team, but these are the players who started the majority of City's games in 23-24. No Gundogan, De Bruyne, Grealish or Stones. Walker went from having the 10th most minutes of any City player to the 4th most. Half the outfield players changed, including the most important player to the John Stones system, John Stones. Moreover, De Bruyne's injury in the first game against Burnley necessitated a tactical shift. Against Newcastle in the next league game, Guardiola unveiled a new strategy. Instead of forming a box midfield by pushing a defender alongside Rodri, a defender moved to the wings, allowing the winger to tuck inside and effectively play as a midfielder in possession. This is the so-called false winger role, primarily achieved by Kyle Walker pushing up to the right wing and Foden tucking into the right central midfield zone. The benefits of this were obvious from that first outing against Newcastle. The box midfield was achieved, allowing City that numerical superiority in the centre of the park, but it also unlocked the prospect of Phil Foden being utilised as a midfielder consistently. In De Bruyne and Stones' absence, and following the departure of Gundogan, City's treble-winning midfield was unrecognisable. Someone had to step up to fill that void. Foden delivered. Of course, City missed De Bruyne's creation and Haaland's finishing, but Foden's performances and contributions in this period kept City alive in the title race. City would also flirt with a diamond midfield, but in the main, the box midfield was Pep's system of choice. However, despite some standout performances, systemic issues emerged in City's play. Guardiola experimented with Julian Alvarez in a midfield role to replicate the goal threat of Gundogan and De Bruyne. This provided City with a great ball striker from outside the box, and when positioned to Erling Haaland, Alvarez exploited the space created by Haaland's movement and gravity. But the trade-off wasn't worth it. Alvarez's underperformance on his expected goals and his inadequate link-up play disrupted City's build-up and chance creation. His poor first touch and lacklustre link-up abilities in deeper zones were continually exposed, as was his decision-making in respect of when to attempt riskier passes. Foden, when shunted to the wings to accommodate Alvarez, was less effective. City's dropped points in 7 of the first 19 games reflected this, particularly in matches against Big Six opponents, where Foden was played out wide. His reduced ball reception limited his ability to influence games, and only when given the freedom to drift inside did he show his true quality. It was a graveyard shift at times and a consequence of accommodating Alvarez. But even when Foden was played in midfield, there were inherent flaws in the new tactic. The false winger system relied on the right back pushing up to right wing, not only to hold the width and to create space for others, but to then be an offensive and creative threat in their own right. Walker offered little to no offensive threat in this system and wasn't suited to the role of a wide playmaker. His creative numbers, despite being played so far up the pitch so often, were somehow worse than Nathan Ake's in this period. Consequently, City's right side became stagnant, and they found themselves forcing the play down their left far too often. This usually meant City's play was directed around Doku, who hadn't yet adapted to City, nor had his teammates properly adapted to him. Playing a defender so far up the pitch also weakened City's rest defence, how set up defensively when in possession. Turnovers often caught Walker out of position, and combined with defensive errors, led to dropped points against Wolves, Spurs, Chelsea and more. Rodri too was stretched thin, tasked with both his role and Gundogan's. His individual performances were stellar, and the comparison of his data from last season to this season demonstrates the offensive task he'd been dealt. But the burden was unsustainable. Too often, Rodri would be left on an island in midfield, especially on the counter-attack against the better sides. Rodri's biggest weakness is his transition defending and ability to cover ground quickly. Leaving him on his own to lock down the entire midfield was an impossible task. Bernardo was simply not offering enough positional support when he was played centrally. The midfield was frail and couldn't provide adequate protection to the defence. Attempts to remedy this by reverting to the Stones system using a kanji were only partially successful. The difference in on-ball quality and comfortability was stark, exemplified in the chaotic 4-4 draw against Chelsea. The Stones system just wasn't a reliable go-to option for Guardiola. Injuries to key players like Stones, De Bruyne and Grealish. Haaland underperforming on his XG for the first time since joining RB Salzburg. The poor form of Walker. Foden not being utilised optimally to accommodate Alvarez. Forcing the play through Doku. Losing control, but not quite leaning into the chaos enough to make that fact worthwhile, resulted in City accumulating just 40 points after 19 games, and Pep enduring his worst ever period as a manager in the league, at one point just winning 1 out of 6 games. Relative to City's high standards, the strategy was not working. Guardiola's decisions, particularly not utilising his best players optimally, were questionable. This culminated in a bizarre lineup against Aston Villa, where despite having options like Foden, Bernardo, Kovacic, Nunes and Bob, none started in midfield. Despite City's struggles, neither Liverpool nor Arsenal capitalised fully. Regardless, significant changes were needed if City were to defend their crown.
De Bruyne looking to shoot, oh, he scored! Kevin De Bruyne is back!
Phase 2 began with the much anticipated return of De Bruyne from his long-term injury, and would end after the draw to Arsenal. The match at St James's Park was a pivotal moment in City's season, not only because of De Bruyne's comeback, but also due to Guardiola's new tactical innovation. Doubling down on the strategy of involving defenders in attacking phases, City transitioned from a 3-2-2-3 formation to a 2-3-5, with both Guardiola and Walker advanced as wingers. This high-risk system made City even more susceptible to counterattacks, but the payoff was a greater ability to pin back the opposition. It became a balance of quality versus quantity, inviting more dangerous counterattacks and shots, while reducing their frequency by maintaining better overall control of the game. During this phase, we witnessed the first glimpses of Foden and De Bruyne operating together in midfield. De Bruyne was given a more fluid, floating role, while Foden focused on exploiting the pockets of space. Despite missing half the season, De Bruyne's final playmaking numbers were astonishing. This system also mitigated Walker's deficiencies in respect of offensive thrust. Instead of being involved in the initial build-up and creating chances himself, Walker now arrived onto chances set up by others, simplifying his role and leading to a noticeable improvement in his chance creation statistics compared to the first half of the season. But problems persisted. Despite the tactical adjustments, City ended this phase in 3rd place, having scored fewer and conceded more goals than both Arsenal and Liverpool. The pairing of Foden and De Bruyne in midfield was promising, but opportunities to see them together were scarce. They started together in midfield only once at Brentford away. In the 3 games City dropped points in against Chelsea, Liverpool and Arsenal, Foden was given the graveyard touchline shift, limiting the influence of City's best performer. Conversely, Alvarez started 5 games in midfield, including the suicidal tactic of playing him alongside Rodri in a midfield duo against Chelsea. Rodri was still not being provided with enough midfield support, with Kovacic only starting 2 games in this period. Haaland was still having a poor time with finishing. Stones and Grealish were still not reliable from a fitness perspective. Even Bernardo Silva, someone so consistent and brilliant for City, struggled to find his best form. The performances in this period highlighted the ongoing challenges Guardiola faced in balancing his squad amidst injuries and tactical experimentation. Whilst this 2-3-5 formation offered new offensive avenues and tactical flexibility, it also underscored the vulnerabilities and adjustments still needed for City to regain their dominant form. The 0-0 against Arsenal also exposed the key offensive weakness of the system. Wingers had been replaced with defenders. Naturally, Walker and Guardiola were not as creative as a true winger. More support and off-ball runs were needed in those wider zones and in the half spaces. After that draw to Arsenal, given the lack of games, points and goal difference gaps, City needed to achieve perfection by winning all 9 of their remaining matches. Their best run of consecutive league wins up to that point was just 5. Pep needed to find a solution to the problems of his own making, and this was achieved in Phase 3. Perhaps appreciating that Foden's midfield performances could be ignored no longer, Guardiola constructed a side which provided stability at the base of the midfield, whilst allowing Foden and De Bruyne to flourish in tandem. This would have been impossible but for City's new Croatian signings, Guardiola, Kovacic. Throughout the majority of the season, Kovacic had been utilised as an 8. His conversion to a much deeper pivot player in this period was essential. Partnering Rodri and Bernardo in the deeper midfield 3, it allowed Kovacic to excel in the earlier phases of play, whilst diminishing his involvement in the final phase, thereby masking his greatest weakness. The change also provided Rodri with greater security and City generally with more control. This had been a feature of play absent from City all season given the unavailability of Grealish. So that was a change to City's defensive 5, but the change to the offensive 5 was equally as important to properly unlock an attacking partnership of Foden and De Bruyne. With Guardiola pushing up to the left wing and becoming more involved in the attacking play in his hybrid role, this allowed Foden to drop into midfield on a permanent basis, linking up properly with and supporting Guardiola on that left side. Some individual defensive concerns remained, but the thought process was clearly to overwhelm and outscore the opposition and succeed more attacks, allowing for City's better box defenders such as Ruben Diaz, who had hit form, to engage in more direct defensive actions. And the gamble ultimately paid off. For the first time in the season, there was a concerted effort by Guardiola to optimise Foden. Alvarez was dropped from midfield when Foden was on the pitch. Foden started 6 of the final 9 games, all from midfield, and overperformed on his XG to a world-class standard. This chart tracks Foden's goals versus expected goals across the entire season. Note the ridiculous leap when it came to the title run-in, when every game was an absolute must-win. Note the areas on the pitch Foden took these shots from. This would have been impossible but for the midfield shift. He was named the official man of the match in half of those games, and the number of goals scored from outside the box was a record for a City player in the Premier League era. Haaland wasn't having his best goal-scoring season, but his gravity was at least creating the space outside the box for his teammates. City won 4 games against the top 6 across the entire season. 2 of those wins came in these 6 games Foden started. Doku also came into his own by becoming a reliable weapon against low blocks as an impact player. Haaland was finally performing equal to his XG. Grealish was involved in all 4 goals against Crystal Palace. Bernardo's change from the right wing to the deeper midfield zones was providing City with far more on-ball control and security. This is what eventually won City the title. Through all the absences and underperformances, Guardiola had finally settled on his best side and preferred shape, finally acknowledging that in order to win the title this season, he would have to trust and rely on the individual brilliance of the team. The team which ultimately, despite everything, made history. But this tactic is far from perfect. City are going to have to go in hard this upcoming transfer window to resolve some of its flaws. I've identified 3 players I think City must sign in order to defend their Premier League crown. That video will be released in the near future, so make sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you don't miss out.